to deal with this. The first thing is we're going to do it properly in the Gemara so you guys get a sense of it. And the second thing is afterwards I'll unpack it by conceptual, step-by-step breakdown with simplification, because the simpler we can make it, the more we understand it. So basically, the Gemara quotes the Mishnah's ruling and examines it. And whenever it says the master said in the Gemara, Amar Mar, it means obviously the Tana. And when is that time that the evening Shema must be recited? It uses the word from the time, meaning the earliest time. From the time that Kohanim who were Tameh, which is a state of impurity, may enter to eat their teruma. And as Lance said, when the 3 stars come out, the small stars, so it's Seit HaKochavim, okay? And as we said, the reason why it didn't just state when the 3 stars come out is merely to show that the Kohanim, as far as a crop offering is concerned by Klal Yisrael, they can partake of it after immersion and when the 3 stars come out, as opposed to a sacrifice which can only be done the next day and after the sacrifice for the sin or for somebody bringing it, and that's done, then they can partake of the animal sacrifice. So it correlates the time of the Shema from when Kohanim may enter to eat the teruma. But there is a conflicting rule in the Brisa, because what the Gemara generally does is it says, look, let's bring out all the opinions and see where they contradict each other and find out at what point it's reconcilable, where the opinions are just too different and what do we do with that and at what point they're compatible. So the first Brisa that we learn is from when may we recite the Shema in the evenings, and it says from when a poor person enters to eat his bread with salt. So notice there's a word there. It's not when a poor person eats his bread with salt. It uses the word when a poor person enters to eat his bread with salt. That is significant. And then until the time he gets up to take leave from his meal. So if you look at the Brisa, it's basically suggesting the earliest time and the latest time. And what the problem is that if you have a look, this term of b'shachbacha, when you lie down, refers to the time when people are going to sleep. So it seems a little bit early so far. And the Gemara says, look, if you observe the Brisa, especially the end part, it states that the latest one may recite the evening Shema is when poor people get up from their meal. And that certainly disputes all the opinions cited in our Mishnah. Okay. However, we say don't be really focused on that, because what we're dealing with here is not the latest times, but the earliest times. So let's focus on that part of the Brisa. And it says, shall we say that the beginning of the Brisa, which states that the earliest one may recite the evening Shema is when a poor person enters to eat his evening meal of bread, also disputes our Mishnah, which states that the earliest one may recite the evening Shema in our Mishnah is when a Kohen who was Tameh is permitted to eat teruma. So the Gemara is saying, listen, let's not overly confuse everything at this point. Let's keep it relatively simple. So we have, again, this contrast of the 2 different times. Our Mishnah says, it's a bit of a tongue twister. When may we be able to recite the Shema? From when? The earliest time? From when the Kohanim are permitted to eat the teruma, which is when the 3 stars come out. And Lance, when does the Brisa say that is the earliest time we may recite the Shema? I can't hear you.
The Brisa says it's from when a poor person comes has their bread and salt in the evening.
Yeah, when the poor person enters to eat his evening meal. So we just got to define what that actually means. All right, so that's exactly it. So at that point, we're at the point of the Gemara where it assumes that a poor person eats before nightfall. Why? Because the Gemara is suggesting that maybe he can't afford a candle by which to eat his meal and the cost to be able to cook his food, and therefore he eats while there's still some daylight, because he's not going to be able to see in the dark. That's according to Rashi. And also, his meal's pretty simple. It's pretty much ready and go. He doesn't have the cost factor to be able to cook and prepare for hours. It's very expensive to run a fire with fuel and to have cuts of meat and things like that. So, so that so far is pretty straightforward. Nothing complicated there, guys. Okay, can we go to the next part? I'll try to keep it as
Yes.
simple as possible. So the Gemara is
Just one
suggesting,
thing, Damon.
yeah, Lance, sure.
Basically, the Brisa completely contradicts the Mishnah, though, because
So
the
is yeah,
Mishnah says when it's 3 stars, he's saying no when it's still light, because when it's dark you can't see, you can't eat in the dark. So
I
it's a
think it,
complete contradiction.
I think it's an interesting point, and the Gemara says, well, is it a contradiction? Because Rashi says at this time there's only an assumption that the time a poor person eats is earlier than when the 3 stars are coming out, based on two factors. Number one, the inability to afford candles to illuminate his place, and the cost it would take to cook his meal and to buy that sort of food to enable him to cook his meal, like meats which are tougher and are more expensive. So Rashi said that's an assumption that Gemara is making at this time, that it's two different times between the Shema, according to the Mishnah and the Brisa. So the Gemara is actually asking, is it in fact two different times or is it an assumption? It's asking the same thing that Lance is. So it means Lance is with the pulse of it. And the Gemara says, no, it's not necessarily contradictory, because you could technically say that the time given in regard to a poor person and the time given in regard to a Kohen are the same time. Meaning the poor man and a Kohen are the same measure. Both these times refer to Tzeta Kochavim, the appearance of the stars. Um, and even according to this, it says, look, poor people generally eat earlier than other people. But it doesn't mean that the earliest time is necessarily the only time, lots. And that's what the Gemara is trying to make clear, is that as long as the times for the starting time are the same, and a poor person habitually will eat sooner, it's not such an issue. Now, our issue is, how do we handle that assumption that a poor person can't necessarily illuminate his place and eats while it's when it's dark? And the Gemara presupposes that that might have been a reason. Um, and it's just saying that there's no proof of it at this stage, because all the Gemara is trying to do is say, look, we have a Mishnah and we have a Brisa. Now the Gemara's job is, and this is interesting when you're looking at Havaminas, etc., which means the conclusion that Gemaras are coming to, is that it generally doesn't like to alter the Mishnah. What it likes to do is see how the uh, Brises are compatible with the Mishnah, and it's more likely to throw out a Brisa or to fix a Brisa than to fix a Mishnah. A Mishnah is more powerful than a Brisa. So far it's saying, listen, you don't have any evidence. The two times are not necessarily contradictory. We're saying that it might appear contradictory, but there's no evidence for it at this stage. Now the Gemara is going to bring up the second point and saying there's a problem. And it says, well, we have another problem. This is not the only brisa. There's another brisa. And this is where it starts to get tricky, Lons, because it says, look, if you look at the second brisa, it says, from when may we begin reciting the Shema in the evening? So the opinion is, according to Rabbi Meir, from the time that people enter to eat their bread on Shabbat evening. Okay. Now, Friday night meal begins without delay, and that simply is because there's no method to heat it afterwards, whereas during the week you can cook. There's no prohibition to cook. So far, we've got to know what to do with that. So that's Rabbi Meir. Now, as far as the sages are concerned, it's exactly the same time as our Mishnah. It says from the time that the Kohanim who were Tameh are entitled to eat their Turum again. So that middle portion where the sages generally hold in the Mishnah and the Brisa are not contradictory to each other. It's only Rabbi Meir's opinion that brings a secondary point. It's not about poor people, it's when people eat their breads on Sabbath eves. And that's when it's the time weekday to do Shema. Okay. So Uh, and um, and it says further to which when the sages say that it's the time that the Kohanim who are Tama entitled to eat their terum again. The one thing it mentions here that it doesn't necessarily mention in the Mishnah, it says, and this sign is the appearance of the stars. Because remember that was inferred as a lesson we learned, but here in the Mishnah it actually says it's exactly the same time as the appearance of the stars. And the Gemara goes further and says, listen, if we're on this issue, now that we've got a bit of evidence to the fact that coming out of the three little stars and the Kohanim is the same, um, and it says, even though there's no proof to this matter, that the day ends when the stars appear, an indication of this matter is in the following verse. So now it's going to just go off on a tangent for a couple of sentences. And it says, well, where do we find this? And it says, if you look at Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 15, it says, so we did the work with half of them grasping the spears from the rising of dawn until the appearance of the stars. And it states further in the verse, and the night was for us a watch and the day for work. So before explaining the challenge from this brisa, the Gemara wants to explain why was it necessary to add this point, and it states further. It could have just made it as one sentence. Why the emphasis of, and the night was for us a watch and the day for work? I mean, you could have just said until the rising of the dawn and the appearance of the stars. The Gemara said the reason why there was emphasis is it wants to rebut a following counter argument. And it's saying, perhaps you'll think logically, that as soon as the sun sets, it's considered night time. And the people that worked in the temple continued to work after dark, which was after sunset, until the stars came out, and they began working early with the rising of dawn before the day actually began. So their length of the workday doesn't prove when the day legally begins and ends. And we're saying maybe they just have an exceptional work ethic, or they are expected to work longer hours than what is halachically required. I mean, the reason being is that, like for the temple workers, it actually begins at sunrise. And they only were working at dawn. So the difference between dawn and sunrise is described in the Gemara as a 5 mil distance walk. It's not mile. I misread it at first. I thought it was mile. I thought that's a lot. 5 mil, Rabbi Cohen said to me, is 5 kilometers, which takes about 90 minutes before sunrise. So we're thinking maybe their work ethic is extraordinary and the job requires it. You know, like people that do doctors and nursing, they pull extra long shifts, etc. And the Gemara is saying, no, halachically a work day and a work day consists of when the sun is already set and you get up at the point where the temple workers work, and that is an ordinary working day for most people. You have people that are exceptionally lucky that they've got a bit of a dispensation that they don't need to work all that time, but there's a difference between the halachic workday and what people have the luxury of doing. So the Gemara says the whole reason we're bringing this up in Nehemiah is it is considered a workday. And Lance, why this is particularly relevant is because if we're finding out the time when people go to bed, it has to coincide with when their workday ends. If somebody wants to say that people are already going to bed when people haven't finished work, then at that definition is when things begin to contrast. So now we go back to the brisa, and the Gemara explains its proof from this brisa that the time that poor people enters to eat his bread can't be the identical time that a Kohen begins eating teruma again. Okay, so it was initially assumed that the time a poor person begins his weekday meal and the time all people begin their Sabbath meal are one and the same. So that's the first point. So before I confuse you and I bring in the Shabbos times, etc. Initially, the Mishnah proposes that when the three stars come out and the Kohanim can eat their teruma, that's the earliest time for Shema. The first brisa turned around and said it's when poor people enter to eat their meal. That's the earliest time. The Gemara turned around after our initial assumption, according to Rashi, and said we might assume that because of their lack of financial resources, they eat earlier and there might be different times. the Gemara turns around and says it's not necessarily at this point contradictory between the Brisa and our Mishnah. It could be that it's the same time. It's just using another proof or a time marker to bring a human behavior to say it's the same time. And it's not necessarily contradictory. So at that point, there's no conclusion that the time that the Kohen can begin to eat his teruma, which when 3 stars come out, and the time poor people begin to enter to eat their meal, is a different time. It's Seta Kochavim. It could be the same time. It could not, but there's no proof against it. What's getting tricky now is when we add the second brisa, because the second brisa is in agreement with the sages, because it's proving that it's the appearance of the stars and it's the same time that Kohanim who are Tama are entitled to eat the teruma after they've been in a mikveh. And that doesn't contradict our Mishnah. What contradicts our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir in the second brasa that turns around and says, what's the earliest time to say Shema? From the time that people enter to eat their bread on Sabbath evening. So this is when it's going to start to become tricky, is how can these times be the same? One of the reasons why it's a little bit tricky is we can say it's probable that the time that people enter to eat their meal on a Shabbos is earlier than the time the 3 stars come out. And because we can't reheat food. Now, Lance brought an interesting point last time, and he said, but there's still an obligation to do Mariv and Kabbalat Shabbat, and you have to wait till the stars come out to be able to fulfill the mitzvah. Do you remember you asked me that, Lance? So that's what it's going to start to mention, is that, like, how do these timelines coincide? Gavin, Arthur, are you feeling okay? Have I lost you?
No, you haven't lost me.
Okay, let's go on. So the Gemara is now going to try and tackle this issue. So it was initially assumed that at the time a poor person begins eating his weekday meal and the time all people begin their Sabbath meal are one and the same. And what was the premise of this? Is because the reason people eat early on Shabbat evening during the week is because their food has been prepared before nightfall and they can't cook on Shabbos. But by the same token, poor people sit down and eat during the week earlier than ordinary people, it was assumed, because their meals consist of simply bread and salt, and they take little time to prepare. And even the suggestion was made that perhaps that they can't afford to eat in the dark. They can't afford to have illumination and have to eat in the dark. So, it's logical to perhaps presuppose that the 2 times are similar. Now, this is the problem. This is the logical problem. If you want to say that the time given in regard to a poor person and the time given in regard to a Kohen are the same time, then the opinion of the sages and the Bryce is the same time as Rabbi Meir there. Do you see the problem? I can spell it out for you, but do you see the problem?
Let's spell it out first.
Okay, no problem. So basically, Rabbi Meir stated that the time of Shema begins when people enter to eat their Sabbath evening meal. Now, if that's the identical time when poor people enter to eat during the week, the Gemara now assumes that the time that Kohanim enter to eat teruma is also identical to the time that poor people enter to eat. Then the time of the Kohen is also the same time that all people eat in Sabbath Eve. And we're saying there's a problem with it, because then why bring Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Meir, however you choose to pronounce it, because he's saying the same thing as the sages. So the bottom line problem is why we never bring opinions that are in agreement with each other. It basically is pointless. Do you get what I'm saying? If everybody's saying the same thing, you don't bring it. The only point you bring is a contrasting opinion or contradicting opinion. So it's saying that why bring up this issue if the sages agree? So at this point, it's got this solution, and it's saying maybe you want to assume We know there's no contradiction to the Bryce and the Mishnah necessarily now, because we say poor people eat when the three stars come out, and that's the same time that poor people eat when it's Shabbos that comes out, because they both eat a little bit earlier during the week if it mimics the Shabbos meal, because poor people don't have a lot to prepare their meal. And it's the same token that people after Shabbat want to eat as soon as possible. Now, there's obviously a contradiction, because if the sages say that three stars have to come out, and Rabbi Meir is saying that it's when we eat on Sabbath Eve, it can't be the same opinion. Can't be, otherwise why bring Rabbi Meir? That's the problem the Gemara is having so far. It's saying they can't be all at the same time. There's a problem. It says, because it can't be, for the Brisa cites them as opposing views. Rather, you should learn from this that the time stated in regard to a poor person is a time to itself, and the time stated in regard to a Kohen is a time to itself. In other words, they're different times. So this disproves the earliest assertion that they are the same time, perhaps. We're just saying it can't be. There's something wrong, because Rabbi Meir is a different opinion to the sages. It can't be. They've got to be different time. So, otherwise, why bring a contradicting opinion? So the Gemara says, no, we're jumping at a conclusion. Maybe the time given in regard to a poor person and the time given in regard to a Kohen are the same time, whereas the time given in regard to a poor person and the time given in regard to all people on Sabbath Eve are not the same time. So let me just unpack it for you quickly. This is the summary.
Which is not going to be it's not going to be the same time as the Kohen either then. The Shabbos. The Shabbos conflict with both of them then, with the poor person and the Shabbos then.
Yeah. So at first what the Gemara was saying is that there didn't seem to be a dissenting opinion. When the first Brisa says pretty straightforwardly that let me just look at the first Brisa a sec. It was assumed that it's the time when poor people begin their meal. It doesn't necessarily dispute. It doesn't necessarily dispute the times of the Kohen, because in that first brisa there's not two contradicting opinions, Gav. The second brisa makes it difficult, not the first, because the brisa is unto its own, and it says, listen, it's the time when poor people enter to eat, and the Mishnah says it's a time when the Kohen can eat their teruma when the three stars come out. It doesn't mean they're contradictory. It's not in the same brisa. It's not in the same Mishnah. So they're not necessarily agreeing, but they're not irreconcilable. The problem is when you've got the same brisa and you've got opinion of Rabbi Meir and the sages. They can't be saying the same thing, otherwise you wouldn't bring two that are holding at the same position.
Because they're from the same brisa. That's
Correct. So that's the problem.
That I understand. Yeah. You can't make the same point twice from two different opinions.
Correct.
They've got to be different. All right, I get you.
So the Gemara goes back to its initial thought, and it says, listen, you've got to assume, because we assumed it said, no, it doesn't, like under our assumption, the Gemara says, hang on, it makes sense that logically you might think the time that poor people start to eat their weekday meal is the same time that people eat on Shabbat Eve, because both want to eat as quickly as possible. The poor person doesn't have much to prepare in terms of their meal. And it's quick, and people want to eat after Shabbat as quickly as possible, so it could be similar. And the Gemara says, yeah, it's fine to think that logically, but it contradicts the second brisa. Why does it contradict the second brisa? Because the second brisa actually works perfectly with the Mishnah. It agrees that the time that we do, earliest time to do Shema, is when the three stars come out. It proved it. It says because when the Kohanim are allowed to eat their teruma, and it says, and when the stars come out. It even proved it from the Brisa. We haven't had a proof in our Mishnah, but the Brisa said the same thing as our Mishnah and proved that it correlated to the three stars. Okay, so our second Brisa and our Mishnah are dead on track. The only one that stands out is Rabbi Meir on the second Brisa, but the first Brisa and the Mishnah are not contradictory, because within the same brisa there's only that opinion. It doesn't have another opinion in that brisa, so it doesn't necessarily contradict our Mishnah, which is stronger. It might have just been giving a different aspect to where we work on the same time. A different point of view, but it's not contradictory. So the thing of it is, the Gemara is saying no. The one thing that you've got to throw out is this thing that that it can all work together. Something's wrong. We thought poor person Shabbat times card. No, the Shabbos times are different. So this is the summary. There are 3 times listed in the last 2 brises from the beginning of the evening Shema period. Firstly, first brisa, when poor people enter to eat during the week. Okay? Then, second brisa, when all people enter to eat on Shabbat Eve. That's according to Rabbi Meir. According to the sages, when Kohanim who were Tameh may enter to eat teruma, which is when the stars come out. So that's second brisa and our Mishnah. Okay? So in other words, it's much stronger to say when poor people enter to eat during the week, at the same time that Kohanim may enter to eat teruma when the stars come out. So so basically the first brisa is not contradictory to our Mishnah, nor the second brisa of the rabbi's opinion. The only one that stands out so far is Rabbi Meir, who says it's the time that we begin is when people usually eat their Sabbath meal. That's when we begin doing the Shema during the week. That's the opinion that doesn't seem to work, and we've got to deal with it. Are we all on the same page so far?
Yeah, but we don't
Damon,
know
I
exactly
still
what
think
that time is. We still don't know what time that starting the Shabbos actually is. Of course, we don't know the full definition, so
Yeah,
we
so
don't know
that's what we're going to
100%.
go into now. That's exactly,
Yeah.
you're dead on the mark. This is the argument that's going to happen now. So what does that mean? What was Lance's point? Similar, like how can we do it earlier? What's the point?
I think that the first brisa compared to the Mishnah, they literally differ like day and night. That's it. Because the one's nighttime and the one's daytime. Period. The second brisa makes a lot more sense.
Okay, explain to me why you say that.
Because when he enters to have the meal, that can be very much daytime still. It's early, it's specifically before sunset, as opposed to the brisa where it's specifically 3 stars. It's specifically dark, as opposed to being specifically light. So they completely contradict.
Okay, so this is the Gemara's view. Is that Lance, you're right, they contradict. But what contradicts on the second brisa is not the second brisa with our Mishnah. The second brisa's opinion of the sages is the same as our Mishnah, when the Kohanim can eat their teruma, when the 3 stars come out. Rabbi Meir says it's got to be where the earliest time to do it during the week is when people eat Shabbat meal. And what the Gemara is saying is that if Rabbi Meir is bringing the same time as when the Kohanim can eat their teruma, there'd be no need to bring Rabbi Meir if he agrees with the sages. He must be saying a different time. Otherwise, why bring him? And that's the Gemara's problem with the second brisa. It doesn't.
Because he's too logical.
Pardon?
Because he's logical.
No, because he's saying it's a different time to the sages. The sages are logical. The sages are saying it's the time when 3 stars are coming out. Our Mishnah says the same. The only contrasting opinion is Rabbi Meir, who said it's when people eat their Sabbath evening meals. So far we turn around and we say, well, maybe that's the same time that the Kohanim can eat their truma. And we say no. The whole proof of it is a brisa or a Mishnah will never bring 2 contradicting opinions if they say in the same time. Or they would resolve it and say, please note, it seems different, but it's the same. It never resolved it in the brisa. It would have to resolve it in the brisa. How the brisa would work is it say, Rabbi Meir turns around and says it's when the Sabbath Eve comes out. And then the sage is saying when 3 stars come out. And then if the brisa turned around and said it's actually the same time, because it's considered halachic night or whatever, then there'd be resolution. It never did that. It has showed a contrasting opinion and never reconciled it. So the only thing we can say for sure, according to the second brisa, is Rabbi Meir's time and the sage's time are different. They're clearly different. Which one comes first? Well, probably the time when people eat their Sabbath meal would seem earlier than when the three stars come out. So far, the sages agree with our Mishnah in the second brisa. Now, the first brisa that deals when the poor people can eat, it says initially, logically, you think that the poor people eat earlier because their meals are simple, and perhaps they don't have the candle to see in the dark because of the cost or the cost of cooking food. So that would seem to contradict when the three stars come out. But the Gemara is saying the first brisa doesn't have another opinion in the brisa contradicting our Mishnah or contradicting its own opinion. So they could be reconcilable. The only thing we can say is perhaps our understanding of saying that the time when the poor person can eat was our assumption based on his financial conditions. But there's another thing to throw in the Gemara says. It says later, it says, if a normal work person ends his day late, like when the stars come out, it showed you from the temple workers, it said they rise early at dawn and then they work early at sunset and they work until the stars come out. And they say, no, the whole reason it brought this is not because it's an exception, it's a halachic day. It's a halachic day, and therefore, if it's a halachic work day, who's more liable to work longer? A dirt poor employee or somebody that owns a business and only has to rock up to the office for a couple of hours? So therefore, if the earliest time is when the stars come out and most people finish their day, it could be assumed that the poor person, in fact, eats at the same time that the Kohen could eat the teruma. It was our initial assumption to figure out maybe he eats earlier. It was an assumption, but the Gemara says it doesn't contradict our Mishnah because we don't know. And it wasn't contradicting anything of a different opinion in that brisa either. So he's saying the only thing we know that's off here, something's wrong, is that Rabbi Meir's opinion that the earliest time we do Shema is when people eat their Sabbath meal. That doesn't work with anything else. The others haven't been refuted so far. There's a third brisa that comes. So far, it hasn't been refuted. Does that make sense now, Lance, according to that?
Okay, yep.
No, you don't have to agree. You need to tell me what you think.
I'll accept it.
No, you can refute it, but you need evidence. You need to bring me evidence as to what the case is. So we're saying we can't work on logic and we can't work on emotions. What we need is an evidence portfolio to see at what point they contradict. Now, the next part of the Gemara that we're going to deal with is when is this Bein Shmashot? Okay. Do you know what that means, Gavin? Bein Shmash. It's a tongue. Everything's been a tongue twister. Bein Hashash. Can you say it? It's been a long day. Bein Mashot.
I don't have to say. I don't have to answer it unless you can pronounce it correctly. Yeah.
That's right. Mashmot. Okay. Okay.
It's a time of. It's a time of. I don't know. It's one of those times. I don't know. I do know it. I can't think of what it is. Give me the answer.
Okay. So listen, it's this twilight period that's quasi nightfall. We're bringing Shabbos. We can't discern whether it's day or night. And Banash Mashos. We can't discern. So you have to be observing the Sabbath on Friday evening. It's like that twilight time. You can't quite tell. Do you get what I'm saying? It brings it up in Gemara Shabbos 34b. And there's a whole dispute. What does it mean halachically? So I think before we get into that dispute, and we got 3 minutes left, I think we should end for the day because I don't want to add complications. So far, everything's been fairly clear. The third Bryce has got another 5 opinions.
Well, if you didn't want to add complications, you shouldn't have started this year. But anyway, that's just my opinion.
That's true. But did I give it over fairly clearly considering? Did I give it over fairly clearly considering?
Very clearly. It just got a little bit twisted in that last word, but you did very well otherwise. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't say banish mashos. Yeah, well, eventually if you say it. Um, uh, yeah, we're going to go into what that means, and this is where it's going to deal with Lance's hang-up, because according to some opinions, it's ridiculous. It's still during the day, and according to other opinions, it's a second between what's considered halachically night and what's considered day. You can break Shabbos, so therefore it's not as long as you think, and therefore it's a time when people go to sleep halachically. We talk about the earliest time, not when people are asleep, when they're going to sleep. So, all right, guys, I think we've hit enough, but I think we made it pretty clear.
No, you were very clear, Dan. I think everybody understood it a lot better, except for Kevin, he wasn't here, but everybody else did.
All right. Listen, just please God
Okay.
for you, Gavin, a proper refuah, and I just hope in these 9 days that our enemies don't surprise us and we all have unity and achdut together and we don't lunge out at each other and we're all good to each other. That's all.
Fine.
All right,
Fine.
amen. Be well. Cheers.